Let's get this going, guys.
Let's do it.
All right. All right. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate you all taking the time out of your busy schedules. Welcome to Cybersecurity for Law Firms, an open panel discussion by Braintrace and Still Reads, a live webinar. Please hold all questions until the end, and we will respond to them the best we can. My name is Nick Cook. I'm the Director of Marketing at Braintrace. With me, I have John Washburn, the Information Security Officer for Still Reads. Our moderator today, Greg Spicer, Chief Revenue Officer for Braintrace. Also, Aaron Sherman, Senior Director of Cyber Threat Intelligence for Braintrace, and Kate Riley, Director of Information Security and Compliance for Braintrace. I want to thank the four of you guys for showing up and joining me in this discussion. And Greg, I'm going to now hand this over to you.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you to obviously the panelists, but also, most importantly, thank you to those of you who are attending today. We're very excited to have you join us in this lively conversation on cybersecurity for law firms. I think the wealth of knowledge among the panelists here and their collective experience working with law firms is significant. So I think you will enjoy today's conversation. We're going to cover three main areas. One being the issues, the pain points that law firms face, and a kind of a rebuttal to that in terms of what they're doing and what we're seeing as a vendor in the space. We're also going to talk about monitoring and securing your firm on a budget. So what does that look like based on dollars and cents, and what that alleviates, what you can do to alleviate some of the issues that are out there at a cost section will be just putting it all together and managing this resources and abilities of your teams and or cybersecurity plan platform that you would have your firms. And we'll do some question and answer at the end. Comments and questions you guys have at the end of the webinar. So John, I'm going to kick it off with you, being the resident information security expert at a law firm, at a national law firm like Still Reads. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what it is that your firm is facing, the issues, the pain points at night as an information security?
Sure. So we spend a lot of time implementing, strong technical controls. I think a lot of us have done application whitelisting. We probably point, I think we've moved really beyond the technical controls mostly for our, and we're now really in the we know not have the same level of controls we do, so some third party. But we've seen a marked increase over the past couple of years of phishing emails from individuals at other organizations whose email accounts have actually been compromised, not spoofs, but real compromises. In so many instances, usually we have two-factor authentication for remote access. We use long passphrases instead of passwords, just to make sure someone was trying to impersonate someone and actually authentication now. And then last year, they able to convince
the challenges are even in compliance. And Kate, I know that you are an expert at this and working in different compliance areas. So from that standpoint and from your framework, what do you see some of the challenges to be when you're talking to clients out there?
I think that John has said. I'd also add to that change and having a. And some of the complexity with that is getting all of the employees and the stakeholders. Is there's a lot of sort of high-powered attorneys that don't want to be slowed down by the security controls, and so they want to be an exception to the security compliance. And when you're trying to validate for a whole organization, those exceptions are punching a hole into the security fabric, and it becomes a challenge or a pain point for law firms as a whole to how they're going to hold everybody accountable to the same standard. And with that is rolling out good controls across how the data is actually moving around a law firm. Another pain point that I'm noticing is how to sort of secure the data as it's posted to a record management system, or how it's being sent to the client. And one pain point in particular is that clients are actually not wanting to adopt a law firm's secure method of documentation management. And so I've noticed a lot of clients saying, we understand what the right secure encrypted method is, but our clients demanding that we use their Dropbox. So there's that dependency on how the client security is for a potential data breach that could be associated or crawled back, and as the source of it be the law firm. And so those are two really key ones that law firms are struggling with, as well as what John said is if you're an ISO shop and you're trying to be ISO certified, how are you getting that rolled across your other dependencies like vendors and suppliers?
Good points, good points. Aaron Sherman has had a distinct history of working at the FBI as a special agent. So his specialty is cyber crime, and one of the areas of focus for him is business email compromised, domain squatting, and compromised credentials and so forth and the like, and doing those types of investigations. Aaron, from your perspective, what are you seeing from that, and how is that affecting law firms today?
Thanks, Greg. Well, given my focus, right, one of the pain points that I readily see every day almost is the business email compromise, also known as CEO fraud, phishing. When I was with the FBI, that was one of the #1 cyber crimes that I investigated when I was just doing normal criminal cybercrime groups. A lot of Western African actors, a lot of people from Europe and all over the world conducting this scam. The interesting thing about it, and John mentioned as well, there's been a marked increase in this type of activity. Back in 2017, we were all amazed that the fraud losses, the actual reported fraud losses from business email compromise was over $600 million that year. But then when we just saw the IC3 report just a couple of weeks ago from 2018, it jumped to $1.2 billion in loss. And that's only what people are reporting, right? So it's definitely on the rise. And the pain points that I'm seeing is because, and John hit it again also, it's a low tech social engineering scheme, right? So there's a lot of technical controls that we've built in to stop emails with the malicious links in it, with the malicious attachments. Well, what about the email that comes in that says, hey, can you run a task for me? I'm in a meeting, supposedly from your CEO or a senior executive in your organization, right? What about those emails? And those emails are a lot harder to stop. So some of the pain points that I've seen, especially with law firms, are the inability, there's not enough time in the day. Sometimes there's a lack of expertise, and then the decision to outsource or not is kind of a big decision based to be able to identify lookalike domains when they get registered. When a bad guy wants to create a lookalike domain to masquerade as you to try to get a client or a partner to either send a wire or to get sensitive information, minutes matter. And so if you can identify those domains before the bad guy is able to use them, that's great. But a lot of times you can't, right? So being able to identify those domains quickly and effectively, and then take mitigating actions after the fact to be able to mitigate any risk from that domain. Also, not having tools and integrating smart email rules to be able to prevent those non-lookalike domain emails from being delivered, right? So the one where they spoofed the display name, right? They'll say like, Aaron Sherman email, right? But it's some random Gmail. And so that can come in and can really trick people. And then spoofing. But it all comes down to policies and procedures, right? Because it is a social engineering attack. They can get in by any vector, right? Email, they could spoof phone calls, they can spoof text messages. I mean, part of BrainTrace, we do pen testing. We do all this stuff to test, and it's very effective. And so but the one part where it always breaks down is in Kate's area, where she loves to talk about the policies and procedures, right? They could get in anyway, but if your policy says don't send wire fraud, well, don't send wires to a third party without having some type of second channel of communication, right? Or don't even accept an email about wires, right? We don't do that in our company. We pick up the phone and we call, or there's something in place to be able to secure that transaction. But because it is a social engineering attack, they create a lot of haste and a lot of urgency and make it an emergency, and it turns into an emotional event, and then people react to that. And so that's where it always fails. So just understanding that, and then be able to implement some of these technologies to detect these domains and then prevent these emails from coming in is a pain point that I always see. And almost every time I respond to a business email compromise, they just weren't aware. So possibly another pain point is just a general awareness of the problem.
Yeah, that's good stuff. Well, good. I'm sure that we could all talk at length about other areas of concern, but those are the top ones that seem to be bubbling to the surface nowadays. So we have the issues. Now, the question is, when you're dealing with law firms, in my experience, is it's a challenge sometimes to be in the position that John's in, because you're dealing with much different than a corporation and a budget. You're still dealing with a budget, but you're dealing with the actual business partners who that budget is coming out of their paychecks, for lack of a better word, the way a law firm is set up with partners. So to try to get that message across and spend the money, I'm sure John could tell us there's been some different issues and challenges throughout the years. So on that note, John, what do you do? What do you and panel? What do you do for this, and how do you protect on a budget, if you will? What are some of the areas where we're dealing with all different sizes of firms on this webinar today? I saw the list, and it's a healthy list. Some big, some small. So what do you recommend for any and all of these to do this in a cost-effective manner?
Right. Well, first, I'd recommend joining both the International Legal Technology Association, or ILTA, which a lot of us are members of. We also have the new Legal Services Information Sharing and Analysis Organization, which is the LSISO. Both of these organizations have membership levels for firms of all sizes, and they're both complementary, right? In LSISO, you can share threat information, specific information that's confidential, all inside what they call a circle of trust. There's a lot more protection than, when you go to the local meetup and you trade war stories with Chatham House rules. It's farther along than that. They follow traffic light protocol just like the government does, et cetera. And then you go into ILTA, and ILTA is really a forum for absolutely everything else you can think of: information security, information governance, operations management, questions about sourcing, vendor presentations, webinars from security companies like BrainTrace and others, and blogs. There's even an annual summit for all things LegalSec that's in a couple weeks over in Washington, D.C. I'd also, in addition to ILTA and LSISO, I'd also recommend leveraging free public resources. Speaking of LegalSec, I'll be there giving a presentation that will cover 60 free security resources in 60 minutes, free things over the internet that you can use at your firm if you have people in your IT department, or you yourself, or just other people that you're interested in upping your security game. Obviously, NIST special publications, we're familiar with those. Center for Internet Security has stuff, so does SANS, Homeland Security US CERT. You can do email subscriptions, MITRE ATT&CK framework for tactics, techniques, and procedures. You can subscribe to blogs like Brian Krebs, Bruce Schneier, Graham Cluley. There's way too much to list here, but there's a lot of free resources out there that you can use without having to pay money to at least get started, to get people familiar with cybersecurity. I often feel like there's a lot of free information out there, and that I feel like sometimes I'm just regurgitating free information. As far as your organization, especially if you're smaller, can you outsource some of this work? So I don't disagree that there's a shortage of good cybersecurity talent out there, but I think it's a little bit overblown. At our firm, for example, I leverage engineers in our IT group that are really great to do some of the security work. I also outsource some of the stuff to the cloud. I outsource some stuff to managed security service provider. I always use a third party like Braintrace, for example, to do vulnerability scans and pen tests. Even though we look weekly with a cloud-based subscription that we have, we always want to get a third party's opinion to come in and make sure that we're catching it. But that's just it's a one-time event, right? I don't have to staff for that. If I wanted to staff for a SOC at our firm, I'd probably have to hire at least 5 people just to cover 24/7, 365 at a basic level. Do you really need to do that? It's something you have to think about at your firm. If you're really large, then yeah, maybe it makes sense to have a SOC and have your own team. If you're smaller though, could you possibly leverage some of that work to third parties rather than trying to both not only hire a cybersecurity professional, but also keep that person interested enough in their job that they want to stay there and not get poached by the thousands of other offers you're probably getting, especially if they're an engineer on an annual basis.
Hey, John, one quick thing off script on this is, what are you doing? I'm sure there's folks out there that would love to understand, when you approach the budget committee or the executive committee for your budget for cyber and incidents, what's the one tip you could give these guys that would help them get the point across, or would get the budget that they want or they're looking for?
So I would say that, especially with priority items, leverage tabletop exercises wherever you can. So for example, if you have an incident response plan, which all of you hopefully have, each year when you do your incident response plan maintenance, you should run a couple tabletop exercises and base them on areas of risk where you think you could do something to kind of plug that hole. If your incident response team, incident management team is structured correctly, you should have people that represent the firm's senior leadership as a member of that team. If you had a serious cybersecurity incident, you'd want the firm managing partner involved. You'd want your COO involved, or your CEO, or whatever you have on the administrative side. You'd want your internal firm counsel involved, which is likely going to be a partner as well. You might have an executive committee. There's another partner you can get on the team. Plus, all of your senior administrative leadership is there. Do a tabletop exercise. Have a thought exercise based on a risk. So, for example, years ago, that's how we got to two-factor authentication. We wanted to do it as a project, and people said, well, is it really that urgent? And so during our annual plan maintenance, we ran a tabletop exercise about what would happen if somebody got a single password credential compromised. Wouldn't you want to have a second factor just in case? And we ran through the scenarios. What would you do if a lawyer's mailbox was accessed by a third party? And just let the group decide. And at the end of that exercise, two-factor authentication was a top priority. So leverage tabletops wherever you can.
Good point. Good point. Kate, what are you seeing from a way that, as you talk to clients and law firm clients out there, particularly in the compliance area, where are you seeing where they can save money and still be effective in being compliant or on the road to compliance?
I like how you say save money. Recovering from an incident costs far more than preventing the incident or containing the incident. So that's a really good way to kind of phrase that. But I would just leverage off of what John was talking about. What you can do is start the conversation. I have a lot of experience with really small IT shops and very big law firms. And so they're struggled with not having a lot of resources in terms of manpower. And so one of their strategies is to leverage the tools that they have to just do more. And a lot of times we come in and do that risk assessment and realize that there's a lot that they could turn on in terms of security. They just aren't. And some of that is that, it's just once it's turned on, they have to maintain it. And to John's point, then you have to say, can we maintain that in-house, or do we have to outsource that and have somebody else help us support that? So there's options in terms of not holding back your security on the basis that you don't have enough resources to support it, and then get the conversation started. My big tip here would be pull IT into the whole organization. Get everybody engaged in the conversation. Just to leverage again off of what John said, all of those managing partners, until there's something to deal with, then there's nothing to deal with, and they don't want to spend money until they have to. So engage in the conversation. Either do your own risk assessment, or, as John said, do a tabletop and walk them through a day in the life of what the impact would be. So there's something tangible for them to really connect to about why either outsourcing is a good sense, or doing more frequent VUL scans with feedback on it, or, as I talked earlier, that culture of compliance. Give feedback on those attorneys that aren't going to comply with secure data transfer or secure devices, so that you can use that and say, okay, well, that's a great example. What if that got exploited, or somehow was our source of breach and compromise? Then who would we be reporting out to? I mean, what clients would we have to engage and say, we are the source of that data breach? The last thing you want is to be on the front page of any news saying, you're the source of the security breach. And it also feeds into some of those other challenges about how do you get started. I get a lot of law firms saying we're getting asked about our cybersecurity, but we don't know how to get started on it. And so, as John mentioned, there's a lot of free information out there. Download the templates, walk through it yourself. Again, if you're finding it difficult to say, answer some of these questions, because they're probably enterprise-wide. It's not just IT support of a system that's involved in analysis of risk or impact. And so then you can engage a service like Braintrace. We do what's called a vCISO, a virtual CISO, somebody that can come in on site and kind of guide that discussion, help you understand what the question is, do a little right sizing for what the answers are, and help you kind of craft a roadmap of where you are now for cybersecurity and where your firm wants to be. And a lot of firms I'm getting a knock on the door are that they realize they have to implement something like an ISO 27001 framework, a security framework, because they're having a higher demand on proving that they have cybersecurity, and that cybersecurity is going through all of those key requirements and being supported and maintained. And a lot of firms are doing some of it, but not all of it. And I think it's just that outlying risk about, don't wait to have an issue or an incident before your whole firm wakes up to realize you could have done things before that. You could have either prevented it, or, as Aaron mentioned, have an incident response plan. At least know what you're going to do. I think out there is the phrase, it's not if, it's when. And so as a firm, you just want your own due diligence to say, we may not spend all that money right now, but at least we know where we're going with what we need to do. And that doesn't cost a lot of money. Getting the conversation started is, I think, a really good first step.
Hey, Kate, one quick question on that. With all the compliance areas that you see and that you cover, what's probably the number one, if a law firm's out there now going, okay, we're getting different requests from different clients to be compliant. They want to see what our plan is, and what we're like as an audit standpoint. If you had to pick one, what would it be? Would it be NIST? Would it be ISO? Would it be GDPR? What would you give as your advice?
Well, depending on your law firm, it should be according to what your practice is. So if you are a defense law firm, you'd probably want to go with the NIST approach, but I'm noticing it's more an ISO approach. ISO is really a risk-based model, and so it can also be right-sized to your types of risks and to your business services. So it kind of fits easier. It's an easier one to connect to. And one of the key things in ISO is assigning roles, governing roles. And I call it the culture of compliance. But you really have to make sure that IT isn't driving your ISO security framework. It's really enterprise-wide. And I think that's the shift in managing, cybersecurity, is that it's not an IT tool, it's not an IT problem, it's an organization-wide managed solution. And as I alluded to earlier, the pain point is that sometimes that culture of compliance has a lot of resistance, just because a lot of times it's perceived as you add the controls and it slows down business. And the last thing we want to do is slow down business. But there is a balance, and I think some of what I like about ISO is it can get that right balance between the risk, the cost, and the management of it.
Great. Aaron, on this same topic in terms of cost measures and so forth, so there's a lot of tools out there. In fact, I was talking to one of our sales guys was talking to a client today about using certain tools like Proofpoint and some of the others that are out there for email. Those are all great and well, but also there's other areas, and other tools that kind of fight have the fight ended before it even begins, if you will, as is not to let those emails even come into the infrastructure of the organization. And I know you can speak in great length about that. With tools being out there and services like what we offer at Braintrace and so forth, though, what are some of the practical areas that these law firms can use, either internal resources or limited resources in regards to protection from nefarious email threats?
Right. That's a good question. Before I get to that, I love what everybody said so far about talking to the board. I'm sure every one of the panelists and everybody listen probably always has problems going to the board and talking to them. When I was, it made me think when you guys were talking about going to the board and tabletop exercises and how do you do that. It made me think of when I was at the FBI and I would get called to a company because, in the midst of an event that they're having, data breach or whatnot, the board, you sit down and then they're listening to you, right? Fast forward now with Braintrace and we have these really great solutions. And so you go and you sit down and you start talking about these solutions and they're just like crickets, like, we don't want to talk to that. So having these tabletop exercises so they can see in a safe, controlled environment, oh man, this is what can really happen. Then that's a really good approach. So as far so for a shop that has no budget or very limited resources, how can you kind of take control of the threat around business email compromise, right? So there's the proof points out there that do really well at identifying these phishing emails with the links and the attachments. But the majority of the BECs that I investigate in the FBI, and I'll still hear with Braintrace as far as our incident response service, a lot of these are emanating from these lookalike domains that are being created and leveraged and weaponized with emails to then scam people out of money and data. So what can somebody do if they have limited budget and or no resources or very limited resources? Going and Googling every day for your domain is an approach, but I mean, how sustainable is that, right? There are some services out there that do kind of like DNSTwister.report is a website out there, and I have a few other resources too that I could pass if anyone wants to get in touch with me afterwards, or we'll put out our information I think after this. But that you could leverage to identify all different permutations of domains that exist, and it checks to see if they're registered or not, and you could do that. But that again, I mean, you have to do that all the time, right? So it's not necessarily the best thing, but it's something that you could do. It's better than just Googling your domain. So maybe with your engineering sections, you guys can get you go to GitHub and pull down the Python script for DNS Twister, for example, and then just have that running in the background as often as you can, just to identify any of those domains that pop up. That's a good way. And there's a few shops that are doing that. You had, we have no budget, but look what we're doing, and they show me. I'm like, that's great, right? For these non-lookalike domains, the ones that come in with fake display names or lookalike email addresses, the best thing to do for that is just get really good and intelligent email rules, right? So if an email comes in and it has a display name, like I use the example Aaron Sherman, but the email is nothing to do with Braintrace, right? So if you have emails coming into your environment in your email server, and the display name matches any of the display names that your users have, but the email address is not within your organization or it's an external one, then set up rules to quarantine that email, or do something so you could verify it or look at it, and then if it's safe or not, then you can ensure that it goes to the end user. Keeping your domain from being spoofed. I mean, just simple understanding and proper configuration of your SPF DKIM DMARC is a great way to prevent your domain from being spoofed and bad actors using your domain name to try to trick other people. Then the other, policies and procedures, like Kate said, that's really the crux of the situation. But then education too, right? Just letting your users know that this is out there. There's free resources, like I believe like KnowBe4 has some free testing and things you could do. There's some really cheap resources out there to be able to you could test your users with phishing. You could do all sorts of things. So so there's a lot you could do on your own. It's just hard to kind of manage it all in one program and keep on top of it and be able to catch those threats as they emerge, because with BECs, like minutes matter, right? Seconds matter. These actors, they register a domain, they weaponize it with an email, and within seconds they're going, and they're sending these emails, and then they're leveraging money mules and networks of money mules in the United States to try to launder that money as fast as possible. So by the time that you realize that you've been a victim, and then get law enforcement involved, and they find out where it went to, and they finally get to that bank or that money mule, the money's gone, right? So speed counts. So those are some free, easy things you could do to mitigate those risks.
Thank you. And leave it to a former special agent in the FBI to call an email weaponized. I think that's probably one of the coolest words we can get out of this
Greg,
discussion.
I would just add on to that, you know, worst case scenario, law firms should start asking themselves, is it time for cyber insurance? Because in all these incidents, the first question that we have to come through, aside from helping, you know, contain whatever the event is, it's really important to realize that until you don't quantify what the cost is of that impact, it's hard to know how to insure against it. And cyber insurance is becoming its own requirement in a lot of these definitions of security management or management of risk. And so if, as a firm, if you're looking at your whole spectrum and you're saying, all right, we can't actually implement and maintain it because it's too, you know, labor intensive, and we can't outsource it or something, a lot of times you can afford the insurance because you know it's going to happen. And that's another way for you to get the conversation started, to say, you know, maybe it's time we really looked at our budget, we looked at our strategy, and we looked at where we're going with this. And I would also say that I think you got a connection to your law firm's market to grow. If you have this foundation of cybersecurity controls, even a framework like ISO, you're going to have a lot of leverage when you go to solicit new clients, because the first question probably coming out of their mouth is, how is your cybersecurity? You're going to have to answer all those questions. But if you don't have any of that in there, cyber insurance might be a good way to start that conversation.
Yeah, I'll add something quick to that too, actually, if I could. I wrote an article about this in ILTA a while back, but make sure that you have some kind of insight into the outside counsel guidelines or representation agreements that your firm is getting. Not to suggest that they're not being deeply and thoroughly and you know, detailed review, but I get a copy of all the outside counsel guidelines that come in, and I see all sorts of stuff on cybersecurity and risk in the outside counsel guidelines, especially in the addendum. My favorite one was a client whose outside counsel guidelines were called billing and procedure guidelines for outside counsel, and in an appendix at the end were 100 security controls that we had to meet. Now, we met all those controls, but imagine if you were the firm that received that, signed those guidelines, and something happened later. In particular, I have seen a number of guidelines come in the last couple of years where the client will actually state in there, confirm that you have cybersecurity insurance at this minimum level, and that you're also willing to name us on your policy. And we're seeing that come across. So again, not to suggest that guidelines aren't necessarily being looked at closely every time, but it would be a good idea to get that kind of insight into them, just to make sure that whoever's signing off on them is also understanding and reviewing in detail the appendices that might be in there on cybersecurity.
Yeah, good stuff, you guys. Good stuff. Well, let's tackle section 3 here, and that is really kind of putting it all together and managing this. And as you're hearing, and I'm sure many of you who are in this space experience at a law firm, there's just a lot of things to cover, a lot of things that need to be done, and a lot of things that you know, you're trying to communicate to the masses, whether it's compliance or the need for a specific service or application or software. So, you know, starting with you, John, how do you manage all this? How do you put it all together and even move forward with it? I know we talk to clients a lot about a maturity model of 1, 2, 3 years, you know, depending on where you're at. Rome wasn't built in a day. And the same thing goes with cybersecurity. So it's you got to start somewhere, like Kate said, and then obviously there's a roadmap to the finish. But where do you see all this going, John?
Yeah, well, I actually would say it starts with information governance. You know, you can't protect data if you don't know its value, if you don't know what it is. if it's not stored in a system that you manage. You mentioned maturity model. ARMA has a model for this. You might think it's 5 levels of maturity. Can you get to transformational? If you don't have a good data inventory or don't understand your data flows, it's not just about GDPR compliance, right? You might not know where you need to look. You might be looking where you don't need to look when it comes to managing security effectively. We already talked about outside counsel guidelines, but another thing I've seen in there are the OECD privacy principles. They're kind of the foundation of GDPR, and generally we think of them as applying to personal information, right? The being transparent about what you're doing, specifying what you're going to do with the information, giving minimum necessary access and need to know access, deleting data when it's no longer required, et cetera. But those are risk management steps that are good for any data, not just personal information. This week, right before I had to go into a meeting and talk about our mandatory email filing that we have, we've been rolling it out for years, and we have to file email in a certain period of time or it gets deleted because email is not our storage system. We don't have the tools in email forensically to track whether or not something's been accessed, especially in the event of a breach. Nobody does. The email is not designed for this. We had a client send a guideline in that said, you may not store our information or commingle it with the information of your clients. So in other words, to mitigate risk, they wanted to make sure their information was in a container with need to know access, was only kept as long as necessary, et cetera, so that, say, 10 years down the line, if there was a breach, their data might not be there, or if a particular individual had a breach, they might not have access to their data because access is minimum necessary. These are just good controls to limit exposure. And it was a great conversation back to the firm of, this is one of the reasons we required to file email. If you kept it in your mailbox for a long period of time, it is commingled with other data. I'd also make sure your firm knows, risk as much as you possibly can. So we do risk analysis every year. We do a couple of them, actually. We do them for ISO 27001 compliance. We do a risk analysis for HIPAA compliance. But perform risk analysis internally or with external help if you need to of any system that you think might put your firm at risk. This includes cloud systems. You can't outsource risk. If I put stuff in the cloud, then I'm still responsible for the risk of that vendor. Make sure you communicate it to the firm. You're spending time evaluating it. We have the information security forum meetings for ISO compliance where a group of us meet and we look at risks and then we recommend to the firm, here's what we think you should do, accept, avoid, mitigate, or transfer, but we need you to decide. And until you decide, it's accept. Also know your compliance obligations. I mentioned earlier, we have to comply with HIPAA as a business associate, and we all have to comply with GDPR and CCPA when it goes into effect January 1st, unless you don't do any business in California, but I think the odds of that are pretty low. You might also have other compliance obligations as a firm. You might have to comply with PCI DSS if you process credit cards, like if you get involved in collections. If you are a law firm and you do, for example, any kind of representation of government entities that are subject to things like ITAR or ClientSAR, the International Trade and Arms Regulation, you might have to comply to that to some degree too. Know what you have to comply with. And also, you have to have buy-in at the cultural level at your firm. A culture change level buy-in. This can't be a box checking program. For us, it's pretty easy because we have an established privacy and data security practice. And while I am not a lawyer, I'm a member of that team and get to work with the lawyers in that team and get involved with clients who unfortunately have issues with cybersecurity, governance, compliance, et cetera. But because we have that as a practice, we're really able to ingrain that in our culture because the better we are at this as a firm, the better advice we'll be giving. Even if your firm doesn't have a privacy or cyber practice, I'm sure your partners or some of your attorneys have clients who care about it at least. And as Kate mentioned earlier, having your firm be a leader in cybersecurity internally or governance internally helps you get better advice and will also, kind of translate down to your clients as, hey, I trust this firm with my information. There's those lawyers in your firm, if you have them, are a great resource internally for championing good internal practices and security projects.
That's great. Good points. Kate, same thought process on this, and it is all driven. I mean, it seems what comes first, the chicken or the egg, as far as security and compliance, or compliance and security, and it seems like it's kind of a swirling, revolving door, if you will. But on the compliance end of this, you know, kind of what and risk assessment and so forth, where do you see it as far as putting it all together, or at least attempting to put it all together?
I find it interesting that compliance has come into the spotlight. I think every decade there's a focus, and this decade is just kind of kicking off into compliance, and data privacy is becoming its own need. But I would say pulling it all together is really looking at your organization as a whole. Don't look at it as IT supporting the business anymore. It's integrated into it. Business is running on IT. IT is designed to support the business. They are not separate but equal. They are one. And as soon as your organization can pull that in together and look at your security framework as one process and life cycle for your organization, it's a good foundation to really managing and growing and using that as your foundation. Define the governing roles, as John said and Aaron said. If somebody isn't responsible, then nobody's going to report in or feel that it's important anymore. So if nobody's monitoring it, asking about it, enforcing it, that conversation will just go away and it becomes noise, and you don't want that. I think you also need to design your control. That's what a policy is. It's designing the control. What is the requirements? And then the procedure. How are we going to support and maintain it? And a lot of times policies and procedures get knocked off as being paperwork or just something that you design for an auditor to look at. But if you can look at your security framework and design your controls, you can, what I call, right-size it for your organization, making sure you have somebody assigned who's going to be asking about it and help your business define the requirements. As John said, if you don't know what data you're managing, you don't have any means to reasonably secure that data. You need to sort out what has to be encrypted and segregated and managed very specifically from what is not going to be secured at the same level, because those become really expensive costs if your organization says, well, internally it's all confidential, because that's their easy way of not, they just secure it all. And so I see that a lot. It's just their easy answer, rather than going through that process that says, what kind of data do we manage? Where do we manage it? Who's touching it? How do we secure it? How do we know? I think the hard part is, do you know what you don't know, right? How do you know that things are secured as you intended? And those are monitoring controls. And a lot of times firms don't have an internal audit department that's going to come back through and validate that all those controls are in place and working effectively. So if you can, bring it all back up, think about designing it as enterprise-wide. If you haven't defined or assigned those governing roles, begin to map that out. Get that conversation started, and even if it's IT that drives that conversation, quickly begin to realize that you want your other stakeholders included in that conversation, because it does pertain to them and it does affect business, and compliance is here to stay. It's not temporary. And these regulations are rolling out across all of our states, as well as Europe, and so it's getting more complex. And it's really important to ask yourself as a firm, how are you going to manage those costs going forward? And that reminds me of something that Aaron said, which is, is your strategy just to kind of piecemeal it along the way, or at some point are you going to have to take the big step and say, okay, how are we going to manage these costs going forward? That might mean adopting a cohesive tool, a strategy, or possibly just purchasing those services to monitor and manage and assist you outside your organization.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, Aaron, bring us home on this. So BEC, CEO fraud, phishing, email scams, malware, all that kind of stuff, all the stuff that can really take a place down, take a law firm down. What do you recommend in all these areas? Some of it's services, some of it's technology applications, some of it's common sense, some of it's education. Where do you put it all together, or what could you say in 3 minutes that makes sense for people?
I would just say, it is, it's a social engineering, right? They're using technical means to carry out a very old school social engineering trick, right? So just understanding that, and then being able to leverage A good mix of technology with smart services and education, kind of like the trifecta, right? Those three things can really be able to help you address that risk and mitigate that. But like if I were to say just what like one big ultimate recommendation would be join InfraGard, right? When I was in the FBI, I always talked about, join it in your local InfraGard chapter, right? And so the reason why I'm a big advocate for joining your local InfraGard chapter, it's not necessarily, it was meant to be a really good information sharing, but as John mentioned, like, it's not very good for sharing information, right? A lot of times that information goes one way to the FBI and they say thanks and they shut the door, right? But the reason why I'm an advocate for InfraGard is because you get to know your local FBI agents, you get to know the local cyber guys in your local field office, and that is important because if you do have some type of incident or you do suffer a BEC, you need to be able to get a response very quickly. If a lot of people end up saying, hey, I got a BEC, dang, what do we do? They call the police tell them, I don't know what to do. So they call the FBI. So you call the FBI, you look them up, you Google them, you call the 1-800 number, and they tell you to go to ic3.gov and submit a complaint. And you go to ic3, you spend your time quickly filling out as fast as you can. And it kind of goes into kind of a black hole, essentially, because it takes time to get from the big headquarters down and filtered depending on your location to what field office, and then it gets assigned to a squad and gets assigned to a particular agent or a task force officer, and then they'll get in touch with you. And by that time, your money's gone, right? Or your internal counsel's like, or your external counsel's like, what are we doing with the law enforcement, right? What are we going to tell our the board? So being able to pick up the phone and call your special agent buddy and say, hey, here's an issue. Then they'll be able to jump on it quickly, initiate the financial fraud kill chain, and then be able to recover some of those funds, work with the Department of Treasury if it's an overseas wire, work with local law enforcement if it's a domestic wire. So I always advocate, be an InfraGard member so you can get to know your local FBI guys so you can have them on speed dial on your phone. I mean, there's a lot of things you could do, but it's always good to have that. And then, like John said, I'm going to go see him speak at Legal Sec in DC in a couple of weeks. And I'm also speaking as well. So come see me. I'm speaking twice. One on my favorite topic, business email compromise. But two, also mining the dark web and looking for cool cyber threat intelligence to help protect your firm.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Well, listen, we are coming up on the hour. So we have a couple questions that have come in. This one's for you, John, and I think that this actually came in early on, and I think that we've hit it pretty good. But I definitely, you can reiterate some of this. And the question for John is, why do you think law firms are being asked to prove they have a cybersecurity program?
Yeah. Well, it's two things, I think. Number one, it's really three. Number one, it's the data we have. I mean, we often have secret PII, PHI, whatever, all sorts of data on our clients that needs to be protected. Also, service organizations are right next to financial organizations as far as getting hits now, probably going to go up too now that, targeted ransomware has become more of a big deal where they're going after corporations. They're tired of trying to steal $1,000 from grandma and grandpa, and they're coming after the big companies now. But for our clients, it's really about risk management again and cyber insurance. In our policies, for example, in our cyber insurance policies, we have to list out how we treat risk with our third-party vendors, because it can affect our premium if we're not managing risk very well. And I'm sure our clients have the same pressures from their customers. Maybe they're a downstream provider from someone else. Back to that HIPAA thing, under the omnibus rule, we're treated the same as a business associate as a covered entity is with regards to the security rule. So we could just be in a chain of companies and all those obligations get passed down the chain. We mentioned ISO earlier. I think having some third-party attestation of your program is great. NIST has fantastic special publications, which are free, but you also can't get certified, for example, to NIST 853. That's just a control catalog. But you can get certified to ISO 27001 Information Security Management System. You can get certified to ISO 22301, which is business continuity and disaster recovery. So there are ways that you can get certified by a third party and show your clients, hey, I'm not just saying I do it. Someone comes in and also says I do it. And back to the cyber program, I think we are really going to have to tighten the screws in the legal industry over the next couple of years, because if I could put my John Stradamus prediction hat on, I would say we're all probably 2 to 3 years away from having to do SOC 2 Type 2 assessments. We've been asked by clients, I'm sure some of you have, some of you might even be doing it. But the big thing to run by your law firm, if you do a SOC 2 Type 2 assessment, which is there's Type 1 and Type 2, and it's security system and operational controls for service organizations, and we're a service organization, is that when you do that report, you can't suppress the results. So they're not public. You know, if I pay an auditor, an AICPA auditor, to come in and audit my program and give me a SOC 2 Type 2 assessment, great. If I have any deviations, if I say I have mandatory cybersecurity training, the auditor comes in and says, oh yeah, we tested it and 19 out of 20 people took it, but this one doesn't, that's going in the report. While it's not public information, if my client's asking me for that report, I'm going to have to hand it to the client. I'm not going to be able to black out that deviation. I'm going to have to explain it in the report. So when we get to the point that we're doing SOC 2 Type 2 control assessments, the difference between Type 1 and Type 2 is that they actually do a sample audit in Type 2. When we have to do those, it's time to really go back to the firm again, make sure you're not doing a box checking exercise, because if you are, you're probably going to have deviations for those exceptions that Kate talked about with that one party that doesn't want to get on board. And if that person happens to fall under the microscope by the auditor, you're going to have an uncomfortable conversation with the client.
Yeah, it's interesting too. The Kate and I on different adventures with clients, we talk a lot about you know, the SOC 2 Type 2 is definitely coming up much more. It wasn't in the last couple of years, and it still isn't the primary extent of conversation. But we've had some conversations with some large New York-based, you know, AmLaw 10 law firms that say that SOC 2 Type 2 is very important to them and a way in which they're going. So I think that'll be interesting to see in the next few years what that looks like. We have time for one more question, and then for those of you who sent some questions in, we're going to be more than happy to answer them, and we have your email address, so we'll be happy to get back in touch with you. Unfortunately, we're just running out of time here, which I guess is a good thing, means it's been a productive conversation. Aaron, for BEC, what is, or I should say for fraud and so forth, there's a couple of them here, but this one I think is interesting because I think I know the answer. What is the success rate if you've been duped for getting your money back? Whether it's a large corporation, law firm, real estate transaction, what?
Success rate. It's all over the board, right? The success rate, like I mentioned, is dependent upon your ability to react fast enough, right? So being able to have in your incident response plan, what do we do if we discover a business email compromise or a wire went out fraudulently? And then to Kate's and John's point, tabletop that, right? Do your BEC incident response fire drill and see who is in charge, so that you know that when you find out that if it happened, you know exactly what to do, right? You call your bank immediately. You call your speed dial your friendly FBI agent, right? And then .gov, and you do all that, right? So to do that quickly is the key to being able to recover those funds or to be able to mitigate some of the fallout from that event from occurring. So in my experience, when clients already had a pre-existing relationship with me when I was an FBI agent, we were very successful at recovering those funds, even domestic and international wires. When a company had no previous relationship with the FBI or law enforcement, and they were kind of struggling to figure that out, or they didn't have an incident response plan, didn't know they had to call their bank, very rarely recovered their funds. So it's hard to be able to tell response rate or the success rate, but being able to have that stuff pre-planned and already written down and know roles and responsibilities in that plan is key to be able to recover those funds.
Yeah, Aaron, do you think 72 hours is probably a good cutoff as far as quickly? Like if you don't get a hold of the FBI in 72 hours, there's probably little hope.
Yeah, so for the financial kill chain, especially for overseas wire transfers, the Department of Treasury has a 72-hour window to be able to work through the financial system to be able to freeze and pull back some of that money, right? And that's for international transfers. The trend has gone from before bad guys used to have victims wire funds like to Hong Kong or Seoul, Korea. Well, now the law enforcement's got so good at the financial fraud kill chain, those wires, if they get detected within 72 hours, always get pulled back. So now they're leveraging U.S.-based money mule networks to do domestic transfers, and that's really quick. If they can get their money mule to the bank at the teller and pulling out that cash as soon as it arrives at the bank, then really minutes matter, right? And so that's when you have to react quickly.
It's amazing how organized they are. I mean, they know how to make this seamless and timeless. And so it's up to us to understand that and then respect that process and get ahead of it. As Aaron said, if you know what to do when and everybody's rehearsed on it, you have a higher likelihood of at least following the trail, either getting the money back, but you also might say, do you want to keep chasing it and, try to prosecute it or work with the FBI just to shut it down?
Yeah, I think in closing that up, I think obviously the most effective way is to not let it happen at all, right, when it comes to that. And that's basically why we're talking today on various topics. And then lastly, I think we've learned from our former FBI agent two things. One, that emails can become weaponized, and two, you have friendly FBI agents out there. So I think that's a good one. And Aaron, I know Aaron personally, he's very friendly, even though he's a former FBI agent. So with that, before I hand it over to Nick, I want to say thank you to the three of you, Aaron, John, and Kate. And thank you to all of you who have attended to present it, and we'll be doing more of these things. We do work extensively with law firms and in the legal community and have a history in that. Just a couple things that you're going to mention just to follow up. So John will be speaking at LegalSec in a couple of weeks, ILTA LegalSec. Aaron will be doing 2 presentations there. BrainTrace, we will be there. We're a sponsor of it and have a booth there. So we'd love to meet you and come by and say hello. We can talk more and further about the industry in general and what makes us unique. And I think that is it. So with that, Nick, I'll hand it over to you for some housekeeping items and we'll call it a day.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. That was fantastic. And again, I want to thank everyone for joining us. If you have any further questions, please email us at info@braintrace.com. If your organization would like BrainTrace to help out with any pain points that you may have or some topics we discussed, feel free to reach out to us. And also, if you have any other questions or have questions about our additional services we offer, please hit us up on that. You can call us at 866-508-5471, or you can visit us at braintrace.com. We're always happy to help. Anyway, thanks again, everyone, and have a great afternoon.